Welcome, everybody. Good evening from Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and tonight we are celebrating the Writers of the Future, Volume 36. We have a treat for us. We've got two of the winners, both Tim Boiteau, who won for his story Molting Season, and Daniel Bitton, who illustrated his story. Tim Boiteau writes and lives in Michigan with his wife and son. His fiction has appeared in various places in print and online, notably Deep Magic and Lamplight Magazine. And his fantasy novel, The Drummer Girl, is out now, which we'll have links in the chat for you to check out. He is currently searching for a market for his second novel, forgive me, I forgot to ask how to pronounce this, Day, and finishing up a third one. He holds a PhD in experimental psychology and enjoys long-distance running. The short story, Molting Season, is inspired by his gig working as a night auditor at a hotel many years ago. Daniel Bitton was born in 1997 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Daniel, or Danny to his friends and family, began drawing long before he can remember. Unlike other children his age, he drew relentlessly, bringing his trusty sketchbooks wherever he went. Daniel went on to receive a BFA in illustration from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 2019 and attended the Illustration Academy in Kansas City in summer of 2018. He loves to depict fantastic characters and tell stories through his illustrations inspired by dreams, myths, and history. Through a mix of layered digital and traditional media, Daniel's work primarily focuses on themes of dark fantasy, with historical allegories for book covers, usually for a YA audience. When not drawing, Daniel can be found running outside on the trails or thinking about his next project. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Tim to read us an excerpt from his story.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Molting Season. 7:30 in the morning, I find a girl passed out on the sofa, face buried in the cushions, one hand gripping the hilt of an abused longsword. The floor is littered with cold weather gear, the carpet soggy with melted snow. I recognize her profile, the short, jagged cut of her black hair. I've seen her, sword slung over her shoulder, going to and from a rusted Bronco in the house next door countless times. Wondering how she got in and why, I step back out into the snow-flecked spring air and the white haze dispelled by flickering orange bursts of the sprawling refinery's gas flares. Beyond the neighborhood, and a vast swath of industrial ruin. Check the hidden key in the green glazed ceramic frog. It's there. I peer over at the house next door and glimpse a skull at the window, half concealed by the curtain, staring back at me. Catch a whiff of something rotten, like gassy compost. Return inside and move quietly into the kitchen. It's technically dinner for me. Following Fred's disappearance, I've taken over the late shift at the Lakeside Inn and need to acclimatize myself to eating dinner foods in the AM. Steak and eggs feels like a nice compromise. As I'm cooking, I notice a glass in the drain board, which wasn't there when I left for work yesterday evening. Lipstick stained, smells of Smirnoff. Set my food and coffee down on the kitchen table and find among the mass of mail a slim black book, Fintlick Stories, skull literature. Camel butts brim out of the ashtray, also stained in her color. I flip through the book and find it contains 100 or so vignettes, most of them no more than a page long. As I eat, I randomly pick out a story. Molting Season. Molting Season, annual excretion, post-excretory purification, sexual fugue of the female, fern forest, male train, rape and castration of the male train by the fugal female, laying a clutch, patriarch selection ceremony, butchering of the rest of the father train, salting and spicing of the father meat, maternal abandonment, vigilance, downpour, abscesses, seepage, cracks. The joyful pride of examining the slender spines of puggles post-hatching. Consuming the spiced father meat to stimulate milk production. Maternal breastfeeding. Father-led puggle train. Vigilance. Reunion with the mother. Pre-mortem perseverative dream. Suicide of the father. Molting season. I puzzle over the meaning of this story or poem or whatever it is for some time. More of a list, really, an inventory of scenes from some alien nature documentary. The perspective shifts make it especially difficult to follow, moving from the mother to the fathers and back again. From what I gather, a female travels on a feud, attracting a number of suitors, the male train. She mates with one of them, kills the rest, and then leaves the father to mind the eggs. When they hatch, the father breastfeeds the puggles, leads them back to the mother, commits suicide, and then the cycle repeats. I flip through a few more stories, but my mind is starting to fade, the steak only half eaten. 6 hours later, I shuffle back into the living room, light a cigarette, and flip on the television while I smoke. Fields of static, fields of static, fields of static, looping infomercial of bygone days. Slasher flick knives, stain remover, wine, marinara sauce, blood. I'm so temporally discombobulated, it takes me a full minute to realize what's amiss. No one's lying on the couch on the other side of the coffee table. I stare at the emptiness, letting the smoke settle in my lungs for as long as possible, remembering how she filled out the space, the curves of her delicate face, the white-knuckled clamp on the sword. I cobble together a light meal and sense from the awkward placement of food in the fridge that she made breakfast before leaving. Hash browns, juice, pickles, or maybe I'm paranoid. She didn't leave a note. Neither did Mom. I would have left a note if I were her, if I had done what she had done. Try calling Lana for some reality testing, but she doesn't answer, still screening my calls. A Skull sympathizer with a resilient mind, she might offer some insight on the girl's situation, whether she's at risk. I bundle up for a frigid jog and lope out onto the icy road. The street zigzags with a growing jumble of cars, cracked windshields, tires and crises, a few tanks probably ripe for the siphoning. Keep expecting something to leap out and attack me. I jump with each far-off gas flare eruption from Detroit Petroleum. Skulls study me from the windows of the tract housing. Vigilance, I recall from Fintlick's story. I've heard somewhere that only males crossed over onto Earth, an overwhelming train of them. A mile or so later, I'm back home, hands shaking. Haven't freaked out like this in a long time. Chill out, I tell myself, chill out, chill out. That's when the creaky screams are up next door. Goose flesh breaks out over my body much earlier in the day than usual. Impossible to focus or hear anything else. Could call the cops, but they just recommend an earpiece, as they always do. Spend 30 minutes salivating over the barrel of a gun before screaming and flinging it onto my bed and continue living until tomorrow's noonday demon. Hours later, my hands growing steadier, I don a pair of black slacks, white shirt, and black tie, and navigate my station wagon through the icy, broken streets to the hotel. Time of night I leave for work, the house next door is brimming with skulls, and screaming, strobe lights and jackhammering death metal. A scattering of them stand swaying in the snow, staring me down. At work, Carol and I discuss Fred's whereabouts. Well, it's been a week already, so we discuss his corpse's whereabouts. He'd had crinkled skin around the mouth, smoked menthols, had a beer gut. Joked that his real job was doing crosswords. He often joked. When I was working second shift, he'd try to keep me from going home by flooding me with overlapping streams of jokes and anecdotes, each one stinking a little more of desperation. Because once I left, it was just him dangling out over the night in this glass cube of a lobby, praying for the first band of eastern gold that meant he'd survive the night. Watch yourself, young Stead, Carol says, silver-haired, heavy. The second shifter lost 2 sons and a husband in the lemming craze, yet has somehow clung on to a sunny disposition. Don't travel down the road to Freddom. After she squeals out of the parking lot in her hot rod, I settle down behind the front desk and review a typed-up inventory of Fred's duties, crosswords not included, elevator music oozing into my ears. Beyond the glass walls of the lobby, plumes of fire from the Petroleum Corporation light up the lake and highway. Too much pressure building up in the works. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim, for sharing this very mysterious tale. We're going to hand it over to Daniel now, who's going to share us a bit of the process he went through during the illustration for this story.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, John Paul, for having me. Yeah, this was, so it's been a little while since I've illustrated this story, but the process, kind of the working process remained the same. So I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen one moment. Here we go. All right. So the way it starts out, I'll read through the story that the brief I get from the art directors, and I reread several times and work through possible ideation. So try and come up with the least obvious image that comes to mind, and basically everything starts with scribbles, and then I put it together. For what I sent to the art directors are these 3 final sketches with a short description. And this story was so lovely because it was not like a typical over-the-top science fiction or fantasy scene that I really had to present an interesting challenge to kind of really dig in and into the story and put myself in the place of the protagonist. It was like a very surreal dystopian kind of setting. So I went with the dream sequence that's later on in the story that stuck out to me, which is the Mills illustration, and proceeded to, excuse me here. It's kind of hard to see here, but this is a rough final sketch with just some hints of color. I apologize, it's a new computer for me last minute. And going on to the final image. So before I jump into the final image, obviously, I start out with graphite line drawing. I start out traditionally, and then just out of preference, I like working that way. Get nice, interesting textures, and then I'll go ahead and use some ink to push the values, really add some depth. And once that's done, which is really the majority of the work, I'll then scan it into Photoshop to create the finished image. So just really add some pops of color and to push the mood even more. So I apologize for the haphazardness of the presentation here. Yeah, let me know if what else you'd like to know.
Very cool. Beautiful work. It's really lovely to see the behind the scenes process of the work. Those of us that do not do visual art don't always have an inkling of what goes into it. So I've got some questions for you guys, and we're going to be taking audience questions too, so feel free to put them in the chat if you have any. It looks like we've got a couple so far, which we will get into audience questions in a moment. But first, I wanted to ask Tim, the aliens in this story are truly alien. I wanted to ask, what was your inspiration for the creation of these aliens, and how did you go about building the culture? Because there's a lot of rich implications as to what this culture is like that we don't ever actually get to see.
So I think the main germ of the story was inspired by the Me Too movement, which was, it just kind of cropped up. That's when I wrote the story. And it seemed like every day when I listened to the news, there would be another, predator who had done horrible things. And so that got me thinking about, a culture where this is an alien culture where this is just the norm. And so essentially, and, we find these things in nature as well, in spiders and other creatures where the female essentially just destroys the male. But so I built a society based around that. And at the time I was reading this book to my son a lot, which is called Mr. Seahorse. And, in that book, we have a seahorse who has, the eggs are laid in his belly pouch and then they hatch at the end of the book. That's Eric Carle. So those kind of things came together for me. And that's how I started building it. And then more of the work, I think, came in the writing of the literature, because I thought that would, I've always wanted to do that, like set up a very rich world by having, literature, all kinds of other things that you don't typically think about when you're reading science fiction stories. So the writing of that was a big help. And they were all those stories were written using free association, which is a liberating process when you write. And so it was especially liberating in this sense because I was writing within a story. So whenever you're writing, you're liberating parts of yourself that you are not quite aware of. But then when you're going even deeper down, it's like very bizarre things cropped up, as you can see from the story within the story that I just read. And so, I generated lots of free association stuff. I built a language generator, like a program on using an Excel sheet. And originally I had a sort of, the book was going to be a dual translation where you could see the actual alien language, but I thought that might be a bit too over the top. I don't know how many people would care too much about that. So that got cut. But yeah, that was the main process that I went through creating this culture.
And Tim, we have a question from the audience regarding this from Tulio. It says, I'm a big fan of the culturally mysterious literature you've created. How did you come up with the poem about the stuck male?
I got stuck myself when I was writing in a free association. So it ended up, and then it somehow fit together with my concept of their afterlife. And so I ended up keeping it because it was sort of maybe my unconscious mind generated it more than I did consciously.
Very cool. And Daniel, what was it like deciding what to illustrate from such a strange story with such a different use of language?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, because this is so different than what I've read before, and given that it's a short story and the function of the artwork is to serve as a cover, I could either choose something like a more conceptual illustration that illustrates, about the theme of the book, or pick a specific instance, like a narrative imagery from the story. So I ended up, what struck out to me the most was a dream sequence where the protagonist ends up on this like lunar, like moon landscape with a swarm of other males kind of running towards the the mother, the hive mother, and that once I read that, I'm like, okay, for sure, that's I can make a cool image out of that. And that's, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you want to make a interesting imagery, something that'll grab the viewer's attention, but also something that's not like over the top or obvious. And I really kind of like Tim said, was working first with kind of free association, just creating word lists and doing a lot of research on spiders. I remember, which is yeah, which was interesting, but great for gathering references.
So Tim, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested about the usage of language in this particular story. In this story, Molting Season, the language has almost a cyberpunk feel in the way that you put sentences together. Can you tell us a little bit about using language as part of the setting, and any thoughts you might have on the cyberpunk subgenre?
I am a huge fan of William Gibson, and I've read a lot of the Philip K. Dick stuff. So they've definitely influenced me to some degree. During the writing of this story, I had been sort of on this steady daily diet of Raymond Carver short stories, which if anyone has read him, you'll know it's a very minimalist style. There's a lot of dialogue without attribution, so you have to sort of understand just based on what's being said about who's saying it. And there's a lot of you know, very pared down sentences, getting rid of any kind of words that are unnecessary. For example, like I noticed that in this Molting Season story, I tend to omit the first person pronoun from the sentence a lot. So you just sort of, you jump into the sentence with the verb. And I think that kind of gets at the feel to it. But there's also something, maybe you go a little, you get this clip sort of colloquial style of speech where it's more like you're kind of in the narrator's head a little more than you are reading something that somebody wrote out. So that was kind of how I approached this. And another thing that I think may evoke this association with cyberpunk is that there's like, if you ran your finger over the surface of the story, it comes back with grime, you know, because like everything, if I use an adjective, there's rust on things, there's broken windows, and then you have the petroleum works, the flares, that's very Blade Runner, right? So yeah, details like that, I think really help evoke that, you know, cyberpunk feel.
I'm interested too, if you could, I know this ended up getting cut because you thought the audience wouldn't like it, but I love the idea of a language generator. Can you talk about what made you decide to do that as a device when building your story, and also how that affected your use of language once writing it?
Well, I come up with this generator. I had written another novel, which I ended up scrapping because I just, at the end, it wasn't very good. But in the process, I came up with this language, and in order to make it easier for myself, I built this, just a spreadsheet that you can assemble possible speech sounds together, and you can apply, you know, different rules so that when the sounds combine, they change a little bit just based on, you know, I've studied linguistics a bit, so I understand the sort of how the building blocks work in language. So that helped me put this together. And so it was very easy just to take this tool that I had used and make use of it in a different way for this alien language. A lot of it came from my approach to their speech was just to put lots of sounds together that you would not encounter in English. That was one of the main, the starting points, just so that it kind of like there's something a little bit icky about when you encounter the word, like you don't feel right when you're reading it. That's kind of what I was trying to go for. But in the end, the dual translation thing looked way too cluttered, and so that's why I cut it. But you can see remnants of it because later on, the girl, it turns out that she has picked up the language a bit, and so she dropped some words in there. So yeah, it kind of the legacy of it lived on a little bit, but yeah, unnecessary probably.
The few words from the alien language that are there definitely help build the feel of the story. So back to Daniel, I wanted to ask, in your illustration for Molting Season, you've basically depicted what I took to be one of the greater mythos of the story. And I wondered what challenges did you face doing that versus a specific scene, but also when illustrating a story, whether Molting Season or a novel or another story, how do you go about deciding whether to illustrate specific scenes or broader concepts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say um, one of the immediate challenges was as far as like world building and composing the image was really trying to get a sense for uh, something that encapsulated the mood and the feel of like of the story. So for me, I mean, I felt like in the best way possible I felt I was in a fever dream, so very uneasy feeling. And my favorite part about this was coming up with the character design of the alien mother, with wielding the long sword mentioned in the beginning. And I had yeah, just trying to come up with the least obvious visual solution to the problem, which was coming up with an image. So a lot of little sketches, a lot of early on problem solving in the sketchbook before I ever take it to the next stages. And narrative versus conceptual illustration, it really depends on what the function of the artwork is. So if it's in a children's book, for example, a chapter illustration in the book is gonna really kind of describe what you're about to read in the story, versus something in the New York Times where a spot illustration is a little bit more conceptual, doesn't give everything away. Uh, for a short story cover, it kind of acts more like a poster. So it's like almost like a preview, but something that will grab your attention. So in a sense, I kind of combined the narrative scene from that dream sequence that really got my attention, along with some more like overarching themes in the story.
And do you have a preference for one or the other, and what gives you the most freedom for interpretation as an artist while staying true to the story?
Yeah, so definitely, I felt because the way this was written, I was allowed to kind of be more free with how I was going to portray everything. Just because it's not like there wasn't like such distinct descriptions of what was happening. I was able to kind of like uh, come up with a more conceptual solution to it, versus like if you're given like um, you know a job where it has like kind of predetermined characters, you kind of have to illustrate it one to one if it's for a story. In this case, I wanted to kind of create a window into this world, this really surreal world, where I had free reign to come up with um, the imagery. So that was a lot of fun for me.
And back to Tim, there's a lot of very interesting conceptual stuff going on behind the alien culture. And one thing that particularly stuck out to me was the line, repetition is taboo. Can you elaborate on this concept and why this would be a taboo in the alien culture you've depicted?
So there are a couple of things. For the one, on the one hand, males, I think this taboo is kind of a tool for suppression, because the males, they're not very aware of the situation that they're in. Obviously, they go through basically one reproduction cycle and then that's it. And so, I guess their belief is that that is life, is not experiences, events are not meant to be repeated. And but it's something that would only apply to the male aspect. So if the females, they can see the bigger picture of how the culture functions. So that was one thing. But on the other hand, it also applies to the act of suicide. So in this sense, they share something with our taboos, around suicide, the stigmas attached to it. In this sense, when, in their culture, when they commit suicide, they are essentially dooming themselves to this strange afterlife of repeating dreams. So that was where the line came from, essentially.
Very cool concept, and I like how you're able to depict so much in that culture with so few words. Daniel, we've got a question for you from the audience. This one is from China. She says, your work is great. You're right, the texture really adds something. Common question, but what are your influences as an artist? And I might add to that question, what made you decide to want to go into illustration in particular?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, go ahead and list just a bunch of artists, but I guess the best way to go about it is I've recently been into a lot of the turn of the century Art Nouveau magazines. For instance, Jugend, which is youth in German. So a lot of those were like really fine line work with bold kind of graphic shapes, and a lot of like golden age illustrators like Mead Schaefer and Dean Cornwell just kind of set the bar really high. Some of the more contemporary artists I admire are like João Ruas from Brazilian illustrator, Michael Whalen, Brahm. Those are all like just some of my favorite fantasy illustrators. And I'm sorry, what was the second part to that question?
I was curious what drew you into the field of illustration versus, say, I loathe the term, but fine art.
Oh, sure. Well, in school so I went to just a kind of brick and mortar art school. So first year you get a chance to try. It's called foundations. You try all sorts of different mediums, just so people don't kind of from the start, entrench themselves into that what they think, and not get exposed to other things. I kind of knew early on, just because of the artwork I was a fan of was illustration, and I guess yeah, some people halfway through school kind of just took a different route. I knew just from the work, the artwork I enjoyed. It was commercial, it was book covers or on comics or posters, but still had the kind of fine art feel, if that makes sense.
And Tim, I wanted to ask you about your degree and profession, but before that, I want to go to your work earlier as a night auditor at a hotel. I used to be a graveyard shift doorman at a hotel, so I understand that environment. And I used to write a lot of vampire stories in between guests coming in. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience there and how it inspired this story? I know for me, the endless dark, the cold, not seeing very many people was kind of a juicy environment to work with. But how did that work for you?
Well, yeah, all of that, there's a sense of isolation sitting out there alone, and the type of people you deal with that check in, after 11 p.m. They're the seedier type of people who visit hotels, and so I think that especially that element that influenced this story to some degree. But there was also a kind of sense of liberation working there, because there's essentially an hour of work, and then beyond that, you can just kind of wander around the hotel, or you can read books, or do all kinds of things, write vampire stories as you did. So it's interesting, because it's like when you're wandering around, like an empty kitchen, it's very like The Shining or something. It's a very strange environment to be in, and at times you have to look back and ask yourself what you're doing in this place. Why are you the only one here? And that, I think, kind of inspired the dystopian setting of the story, because it took that sensation that you get at 3 a.m. or whatever, and you're sort of spreading it out across the whole world. So that was just me trying to get the sort of the feel of being alone at 3 a.m. and applying it into fiction.
And in the audience tonight, we have Andy Dibble. Hi, Andy. He's also one of the winners of the contest, who is in Writers of the Future 36 anthology. He says a taboo against repetition seems to also speak on the repetitiveness of the hotel setting. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tim?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah, you have all these rooms, identical rooms, lined up back to back, and then the routine of sitting at the desk, you're doing the same thing over. I essentially I tried to do that in the writing of the story, where you see that he is also like events are repeating for him, like the girl keeps popping up on his couch. He tries to call this Lana or whatever. But yes, the hotel is probably part of the inspiration for this repetitive kind of like Groundhog's Day feel of the story.
And Daniel, in your bio, you mentioned that you work with both digital and traditional mediums. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your preferences to medium, working with them together, and why you make those kind of choices.
All right, sorry about that. Sure. Well, I guess the easiest answer was a couple answers, but I guess early on I was trying to mimic the work of my favorite artist who worked in comics, and at the time, that they're not disclosing how they make their images, so I was just practicing different traditional and digital mediums. But really, I can't get over the tactile quality of just being hands-on in the early stages, and but the digital aspect kind of gives you a bit of freedom to make mistakes, and especially with illustration, working in tighter deadlines, having to make last minute edits and things of that sort. So with traditional, I mean, working traditionally, at least in the early stages, there's less of a margin for error, typically speaking. So everything, you make sure to plan everything out, which makes it so much easier going forward. whereas with Photoshop, you kind of have an endless opportunity to keep redoing your mistakes. So at least for me, that's how I feel.
So, do you enjoy the restraints of the traditional mediums?
I do, and I think it offers something kind of valuable, even if it's just working on paper just feels I feel less restricted, so I can make especially when I'm just sketching. No one has to see those bad sketches, so I can just come up with everything on paper. But I feel like you can get certain qualities to your image that feel like it belongs in a book. Like a lot of the really textural qualities, that's harder to replicate on design programs like Photoshop, for example.
And Tim, we talked a little bit about what you used to do, but you also have a PhD in experimental psychology. I'm curious how this has affected your writing and your thought process on literature in general.
I think that's why I like fiction, is because it is sort of psychological exploration. It's a very complicated theory of mind game, I guess, that you play when you read a book or when you write something. And I think I was also inspired a lot by Oliver Sacks, what he has done with nonfiction. He creates narratives around neurological disorders, and in experimental psychology, one of the there's a rich history of learning about the mind via how it breaks down, and you learn about memory from seeing amnesia. You learn about language from seeing aphasia. So I have tried to use this as a way to explore cognitive aspects of the mind through fiction, mainly through sort of speculative mental disorders. So this this story, Molting Season, has the perseverative premortem dream, which is a kind of my speculating on another culture's basically the thoughts that go through their mind before death. And I've used other kind of mental disorders in other stories. And I think it can tell us a lot about ourselves if we write about these things and explore them. So that has played a big part in my writing process.
Very cool. And so I wanted to ask Daniel, what differences and challenges tend to present themselves when working with illustrating fiction versus, say, painting a book cover or standalone artwork or working on a comic book?
Sure. Yeah. Another good question. So yeah, it really depends on the subject matter of the piece of the project you're working on, and for fiction, for example, you kind of have free reign to come up with the imagery, right? Because it's not something that's ever been established before. So you kind of get to create this world and choose to show how the viewer gets to view that world. But for things like comic books, for example, presents a different set of challenges where there's already an established fan base, and having to uphold a certain stylistic quality from its established past and yeah, I mean, really every industry, like working for magazines or presents its own set of challenges. But the way fiction differs is it's not like painting a celebrity or a conceptual editorial piece for a magazine, for example. With fiction, you get to really work on get the chance to do that world building, which is something I enjoy. So.
So obviously we're here because of the Writers and Illustrators of the Future contest. And one of the very cool things for people that aren't familiar with the contest, one of the very cool things they do is team up writers and illustrators to have the illustrators do original pieces for the stories. So Tim, I wanted to ask you, what was it like having your story illustrated by Daniel? And what was your reaction to seeing the artwork for the first time?
Well, I don't know if people who are not familiar with the process, they do something called the big reveal, where the artist's work is on display, and typically the writers would enter the room and they would look at the different illustrations, and they would get to decide which one is mine, or they'd have to pick which one's mine. We did it a little bit different on Zoom because of the pandemic. But when Daniel's image popped up, I knew instantly, it was mine, and it was a huge thrill. I got like tingles up my spine. It is, having your work illustrated is it rivals being published in excitement. So I don't have my imagination is maybe not so visual. So just to see someone who is so talented being able to do that, it feels like a gift, to be able to see, how someone interprets it. And I loved what he did. I couldn't have picked a better scene. I think that was probably one of the most visually striking events that happened in the story, that dream sequence. So yeah, I thought Daniel he did an awesome job.
Indeed, it's an absolutely lovely piece. Now, I have some questions that I would like to ask both of you, and we'll go one at a time here. So we'll start with Daniel. I wanted to ask, what made you decide to enter the Writers of the Future contest in the first place, and how many times did you enter before becoming one of the winners?
Well, yeah, first, thank you, Tim, for the kind words. What made me decide to enter the competition was, I remember distinctly, it was the winter break before my last semester at school, and I was looking around for scholarships, competitions to help cover some school expenses, and I saw one that was specifically for fantasy illustration, which is Writers of the Future, and I'm like, oh, that's a no-brainer. I'm gonna submit my work. But really, when you submit your work, you never know if your work's going to get selected. So you just keep applying, and then I kind of just let it go. And then I remember after one of my finals, I got a call from Joni, the event coordinator, and telling me I won. And for a moment I forgot that, because it was months ago that I applied. So I was so thrilled. It was kind of the first time I won a big competition like that. So.
And Tim, how did you find out about the contest? When did you first enter, and how many times did you enter before winning?
I think I first heard of the contest when I read about it in the biography of a writer whose story that I enjoyed reading. I can't remember now what story it was, but that was when I first came across it. And then later on, I encountered it again on the website Submission Grinder, which is a tool for writers to find venues to submit their work. And I've never won anything for writing, so I entered thinking, well, whatever. It's free submission, why not? That was like 3 years ago now. I submitted 2 stories. The first one, no finalists, no honorable mention, just a thank you, and then molting season. So it was just 2 times, but I I feel incredibly fortunate that they like the story.
So obviously you both have work in the anthology, which has been an incredibly successful book, but has anything changed for you? What's been different? Obviously we've had a very weird year in general, especially for the arts, but how has winning the contest altered things for you? Has it altered your perception? Has it altered what you feel you're capable of, where you're going next? Let's start with Tim, and then we'll move back to Daniel on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question, because when I got the call about the story, I was going through a pretty bad time writing wise. Not much was getting published. I was struggling with this book that I had read, and I just abandoned a manuscript that I'd been working on for months. So you go through these phases when you're working in creative fields where just things don't seem to be working for very long periods of time, and then all of a sudden something happens. And after winning this, I did have a very a fortunate run of luck with getting my book published and a number of other stories. So I think it gave me a big boost of confidence and a sense that if I do continue to apply myself, I can probably achieve more than I thought I was capable of, especially. And so, it taught me just to weather through the troughs of, the creative life, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. It was a good kind of positive reinforcement that my work, I don't know, just struck people in that way. So it really, yeah, gives you a boost, or you want to just that there's potential in that sense, and you just yeah, got to keep working, keep showing up, even when it doesn't feel fun necessarily. But I notice sometimes even on days you don't feel like drawing, you can come up with some of your best drawings. So it's just a matter of showing up.
We've got a couple more questions for you. We're almost at the hour here, but I wanted to give each of you, and we'll start with Daniel and move back to Tim. I wanted to give each of you the opportunity to give our audience here a recommendation for an artist they've just got to check out, or a book that you would say you'd have to read. You both mentioned a few that are very intriguing, but if you had to narrow that down to one, what would it be?
Well, I'll start with one artist who should check out. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, I think something that's well, I mean, there's many. Obviously, it's a hard question to answer, but it's someone who it's kind of like the illustrator's illustrator, if that's a term, is James Jean. He's an incredibly prolific comic artist, designer, fine artist. Just something that skill-wise, many of my peers just aspire to reach that level. But obviously, it's important to diversify who you're looking at, not just kind of try and chase after one style.
So for me, I only came to read this book a couple years ago, although I've read a lot of other Cormac McCarthy's novels, but Blood Meridian was one of the most amazing novels I've read. I think it's possibly rivals Moby Dick, in the canon of American literature. But that is, as Daniel said, like a writer's writer, I guess. What he can do with a sentence is absolutely incredible, and he doesn't need to use quotations or commas like the rest of us, which I find it's incredible. But you can read it and you get it all, and it's a Western novel. For anyone who hasn't actually read it, I'm sure a lot of people have, but that is the book now that I think is you know, if I had to tell someone what should I read, that's what I would suggest.
Thank you for those recommendations, both of you. And lastly, before we go, I want to ask both of you, what are your plans now after winning the contest, and what projects are you currently working on, and what goals do you hope to pursue next? Let's start with Daniel, and then we'll move to Tim on that one.
Sure. Well, now that hopefully in the horizon things are starting to open up, definitely looking forward to um, going to conventions, you know, networking, meeting people, meeting art directors, kind of getting the work out there again. It was incredibly hard last year. I had all these plans to go to conventions, and doing virtual is just it's not quite the same. I'm currently working on a lot of freelance work for graphic apparel, a lot of private commission type things, but I'm really looking to kind of get my work in front of those publishers and just get that feedback, or just you know make those connections. So
And right now I'm focusing on novel writing. So I mentioned in the bio one, I just recently finished a horror novel called Ill Day, which is about a guy who suffers brain damage, and afterwards he begins to experience an additional day of the week than everyone else. And then I'm finishing up on another book right now called The Nilware, which is a dark fairy tale. So I'm really excited about those, and I can't wait to sort of have them out there. But yeah, so I'm focusing on sort of longer form fiction right now.
Very cool. We hope to see more of both of you. Thank you so much, Daniel and Tim, for joining us tonight. If anyone hasn't read the Writers of the Future 36, you are in for a treat. There are wonderful, beautiful illustrations in here, as well as some incredible stories by our next generation of up-and-coming science fiction and fantasy authors. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight at Space Cowboy Books Online. Look for the book, and thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, and thank you everyone for coming and listening.
yeah, thanks everyone.